Hi everyone and welcome back to Story of the World Highlights. Today we'll be discussing chapter 27. Now chapter 27 takes us to England and some of the big modernizations that happened there. And then we'll move over to North America and see some of the great revolutionary ideas and modernizations taking place there. So let's get started with England. So in England in 1769, we have the invention of the steam engine being perfected. Perfected is the key word here because the idea for the steam engine had already been invented by a French inventor previously, but James Watt was the one who perfected it and made it really functional and practical for use. Now, the steam engine, as you may know, steam, when it gets trapped in something, it pressurizes and then it needs to be released. And that buildup of energy and then the release of that energy is what powers things using a steam engine. So with the steam engine design finally being perfected, we saw some pros and cons to this. The major pros are fairly obvious, one might think. Number one, it's more efficient. Human beings can wear out, and this machine, a steam engine, as long as it has coal, keeps functioning. Another one is that it's more reliable. When we have different people using different methods to do stuff, using weather or other resources, that weather can be unreliable. We don't know if the weather is going to be in good conditions or not. Is it going to ruin a harvest or not? Luckily, with the steam engine, it is very reliable and we don't have to worry about those things. It will always perform consistently. Lastly, it was way more powerful. Again, humans can wear and tear, they can get exhausted. However, this machine is going to keep performing at the same peak efficiency the entire time, as long as it has enough coal to supply it. And lastly, with this increase of coal being mined in order to help grow and produce all of these steam engine run machines, they needed to be able to transport this coal to different areas. So to transport this, they needed something like a railroad. So the railroad was first invented to help transport coal. And eventually the railroad was made for passenger purposes. It became a lot more faster and efficient than using carriages and horses to travel from one place to another. And this railroad was only able to function due to this perfected invention of the steam engine. So that covers the pros. What about the cons? Well, as you can see in my lovely diagram here, to get coal, it is down deep below in the ground. Now, to do this, the people had to dig tunnels and go all the way deep underground. Now, so deep underground, there's no air to breathe. And so they had to also create little trapdoors to let air ventilate through. Now, just looking at the trapdoors, in order to make those function, they needed small children to be down deep underground, opening and closing these. While you're underground, not just the children, but the miners as well are being exposed to so much toxic air and dust that they're breathing in. And even if they had some kind of mask system, which a lot of them did not, they were still, with mask or without, going to breathe in this toxic chemical that would eventually fill their lungs and coat their lungs to the point they couldn't breathe anymore. And this condition was called black lung. Now, the other conditions down here were not any better. So we already know those natural situations of not being able to breathe and it being toxic to breathe in. But on top of that, when too much of this mining dust piled together, it could create a complete air pocket where there was absolutely no air. And if a miner walked in there, this air vent did not help that spot. And so they would walk into an area and just suffocate. They would not be able to breathe it at all. And this was called choke damp. And even worse than choke damp was that the dust releases methane and other chemicals. And when they're too close together, they can explode. and almost like a gunpowder reaction let off, lots of different explosions. And this was called a fire damp. So if a fire damp happened, anyone near it would likely die. So bye-bye child. And anyone over here who walked into one of those choke damps would also die. Bye-bye minor. So these conditions were not really good. And it didn't just impact the children unfortunate enough to be in this job or the miners who are going down and mining by hand this coal, but it also impacted the women who helped transport this coal while the men were underground with the children, because anyone being exposed to this coal dust is at risk of suffering from black lung. So as you can see, the cons of mining this coal that is needed for the steam engine was very toxic and very dangerous conditions. We also have that a lot of people were forced into this job. So a lot of people who previously were doing farm work or doing other jobs, the steam engine replaced them. The steam engine can do it better. And so now without a job, the only job that people needed was coal miners. So they were forced to go into this profession because this machine did the job that they originally did better than them. Lastly, this building of railroads caused lots of disruption in the land. To build these railroads, they had to oftentimes cut through farms and other land that had herds and livestock on it, and this disrupted and made it very difficult for farmers as well. But the builders just simply didn't care because that demand for coal and the transportation of it was so great. So as you can see, lots of pros and cons to the steam engine, but it definitely changed everything. Now, going to North America, we had two inventions that were very impactful by Mr. Eli Whitney. So Eli Whitney was a young inventor, and he was living near a plantation, so a big farm in the South. Now, if you remember it all, in the South of the United States, they grew this plant called cotton. It's what we use today to make our clothes. And they started to realize the usefulness of this plant and the potential for clothing and things, that they started to produce it a lot. Now, to harvest cotton, it's not just pulling out little fluff balls. Inside these fluff balls are a bunch of these very sharp seeds. So anyone who was pulling out this fluff was likely to get cut and bleed a lot. But slaves, that was one of their big jobs, was to harvest and take out all the seeds of this cotton, called cleaning the cotton. Now, one slave who was tasked with this job could clean about 1 pound of cotton a day. However, Eli Whitney watched all this and thought there must be a better way to do it. So he invented something called the cotton gin. And the cotton gin was a machine that used a tooth-like grater to grate through the cotton fluff and take out the seeds. And with this machine and somebody turning the crank, that same one person, that same one slave could produce 15 to 20 pounds of cotton a day. So a big difference. And if you managed to plug this cotton gin into a water source to power it by water and water pressure, you could produce up to 1,000 pounds a day. As you can see, slave owners and plantation owners, they were going from producing 1 pound of cotton a day per slave to producing 1,000 pounds of cotton per day per machine. This revolutionized everything for them and really changed the game. Because then they realized with a few of these machines, they could become super rich. So they decided to grow more. They decided to expand their farms and their cotton farming. And this, of course, meant that they also bought more slaves to run these machines. All right, the other thing that Eli Whitney invented was not so much an invention as a method of doing things. And that had to do with guns. He noticed that a single gun, if it fell apart, you couldn't simply take a piece from another machine or just get one piece and put it in and then it would work again. you had to make a whole new gun. The parts were not interchangeable. And so he said that this wasn't really smart. And so if somebody was out at war, if the army had 10 men out at war, for example, and one of their guns broke, they couldn't easily fix it with one small piece. They had to go and order a whole new gun for that person. And so you can imagine that that's not really realistic or useful when you're in battle. So his idea was to create a standardized shape for all the pieces in a gun so that if one little piece broke, you could simply replace it instead of having to make a whole new gun. And this idea he introduced to the US government, who thought it was brilliant and requested that he make a factory to start developing this new standardized gun design and be the one supplier for the entire new United States military. So he really changed the game with standardization and the concept of interchangeable pieces. So that was it for our chapter. I will see you next time. Goodbye.